Hello and welcome. This is a lecture review for the William Stallings Effective Cybersecurity First Edition book. Again, this is a lecture review using the material offered by the publisher Pearson VUE. All copyrights belong to them. This is for educational purposes only. Again, the textbook is Stallings Effective Cybersecurity, a guide to using best practices and standards, first edition, done through Pearson VUE Education, ISBN number 13 97801 3477 2806. So again, copyright belongs to the author and publisher. I am just doing lecture reviews on the PowerPoints for each of the individual chapters. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on in. Welcome to Chapter 13, Supply Chain Management and Cloud Security. This chapter is covered the security services related to the use of external providers and vendors of products and services. It begins with an introduction to the concept of supply chain management, and supply chain management issues. Next, we'll examine the application of risk management and risk assessment policies and procedures to the security concerns related to the supply chain management. Reminder, this chapter looks at significant types of external provisions, namely cloud computing and cloud services, and deals with issues particular to this topic. Sections such as 13.3 will introduce basic concepts of cloud. Section 13.4 will discuss cloud security from the point of view of the cloud service customer. So we do keep this information kind of broad. So the first area is about ICT, or Information Communication Technologies. Basically, this refers to the devices, components, the network, the systems, the applications, the software, the people, the users, the overall organization that will interact within digital assets and the digital world. ICT is sometimes used synonymous with IT. However, ICT represents a much broader concept of technology. IT mainly focuses on the technology, where ICT is more than just the technology. It's the people, software, everything in between. Traditional, a supply chain was defined as the network of all individuals, organizations, resources, activities, and technologies that would be involved in the creation and sale of a specific item. It included from the delivery of the source material all the way through the manufacturing process and delivery. While there, in more recent terms, supply chain has been used in connection with ICT. So when we look at different standards, for example, NIST 800-161, Supply Chain Risk Management Practices for Federal Information Systems and Organizations, define ICT supply chain slightly different. They define ICT supply chain as linked sets of resources and processes between acquirer, integrators, and suppliers that begin with the design of the ICT product or services and extends through the development, sourcing, manufacturing, handling, and delivery of all ICT components, products, services to the acquirer. Also important to note, an ICT supply chain can include vendors, manufacturing facilities, logistic providers, distribution centers, distributors, wholesalers, and other organizations involved with the design and development, manufacturing process, handling, delivery of the product or services, providers involved in the operation, management, and delivery of said object as well. So again, it's gotten a lot deeper in more recent years. So what are some of the data flow points for supply chain? So supply chain actually has a specific flow in terms of services. Let me grab my pen. So here we have the enterprise, we have the business, and we normally have some type of ingest. So ingress and egress, we'll just use that. Ingress are things coming into the enterprise. Egress are things leaving the enterprise. So if we are making a product or we're doing something that is being used by other entities, we need to import or have brought into the organization service providers, data providers, hardware providers, or raw material providers, things or groups that are able to be brought in for the enterprise to be able to make whatever they're making, and then it would output or it would egress to either internal or customers we might be selling it. Normally, money flows from the customers through the enterprise back to our providers. Now, granted, the enterprise might collect funding, might collect, a portion of the money, and then from that, anything left over is then sent to the providers. In reality, what's going to happen is the enterprise will take their cuts, and that cut will be based off of the agreed upon amount from the provider. Let's say we're buying something, customer is giving us $100. Well, if our providers are $10 each, the enterprise is going to pocket 70 and then using the rest to pay off the providers. That means what the enterprise keeps is going to be their profit. While information will flow to and from all of the appropriate parties, normally money comes in from the customers and the product or services go out to the customers. So services could be cloud compute services, data center services, network or auditing services. The software or the data could be operating systems, application-based software, databases. The hardware is going to be computer networking equipment, the procedure to purchase items normally used by internally used individuals, but can be packaged, integrated, or otherwise prepared for sale back to an external customer. We also have product services, and that flow is going to be whatever you are making. The information flow is, again, the information, request for quotes, purchase orders, schedules, change requests, complaints, reports on suppliers, performance. Any information can go back and forth. Lastly would be money flow, and this is again on the basis of the invoices raised by the producer. The client will examine the order, process correctly, and then pay the enterprise. Alright, so how does that equate to supply chain management? So here we have again a cycle. We can start with any of them, but let's start with demand management. So this is the function will recognize all of the demands for the goods or services to support the marketplace. It will involve prioritizing the specific demands for an item that is lacking. Proper demand management will facilitate the planning and use of resources to be as profitable as possible for the business. From there, we have our supplier qualification. This area provides an appropriate level of confidence that supplier or vendors or contractors are able to supply the appropriate quality of material, components, or services within compliance within the customer and regulatory requirements, i.e., basically you trust that the vendor or supplier can actually supply the goods that they say they can. An integrated supplier qualification process should also identify and mitigate the associated risks of materials or components or services or lack thereof. After that, we have a supplier negotiation. This is a more of a formalized process of communication between multiple people coming together to seek a mutual agreement on an issue or issues. The negotiation particularly is appropriate when issue beside prices are important to the buyer or who there might be a competitive bidding process. After that, we have sourcing, procurement, and contract management. Sourcing refers to the selection of a supplier or suppliers. Procurement is the formal process of purchasing goods or services. Contract management is the strategic management discipline employed by both buyers and sellers whose objectives are to manage the customers, the supplier's expectations and the relationship, control the risk and the costs, and contribute to an organizational profitability or success portion. For successful service contract administrations, the supplier's performance is crucial. That also means things like availability, accuracy of data, all of that plays an important role in the process. After that, we have our logistics and inventory control. In this context, logistics will refer to the process of strategically managing the procurement, movement, and storage of either materials, parts, or finished inventory. Though the organization and its marketing channel may also be there, inventory control is tracking and accounting of procured items. Invoice, reconciliation, and payment, and this is basically paying for the goods and services. Lastly, we have the supplier performance monitoring, and basically this is a method or technique for collecting information to be used to measure, rate, or rank supplier performance on a continual basis. Performance refers to the ability of the supplier to meet stated contractual agreements or objectives for the organization. So you brought up things like supply chain risk. Let's look at that. So supply chain risk is a more formalized process, which we've seen before. We have our threats. That could be adversarial or non-adversarial. It could be counterfeit or theft, or non-adversarial, more like acts of God. Natural disasters or bad QA. Our vulnerabilities, again, internal or external, those both feed into our likelihood. The likelihood is going to be the probability of a threat actually realizing a vulnerability. After that, we get our impact. So if our adversary, if an attacker can realize a threat, what degree? After that, we have to then look at to what level are we concerned with. If we have a likelihood of 5% of a threat being realized, but it's a high impact, we might review it. But likelihood normally is done in percentage, and that lets us know how serious we need to take it. If it's low likelihood, but a high impact, again, part of that's going to be judgment. But impact is going to be the degree of harm. So let's say our likelihood is something of, 50%, but the impact is high. Well, we'd probably take that way more serious than something that is 5% and high. Because again, 50% is far more likely to occur than the 5%. And again, part of this process is defined in our NIST 861 standard. After impact, that sets us up for a risk. So risk is normally defined as likelihood of an event occurring. That allows us to figure out where our money should be best spent for the protection of our goods or services based off of the exposure. When we look at this, it's important to understand that threats and vulnerabilities, once you figure out them, you can use that to estimate the likelihood of a threat. And their risk assessment would then involve determining the impact of the occurrence based off of the various threat events. So here we have a multi-tiered organization, and this is going to be risk management from multiple levels. So we have the organizational structure, we have the business processes, and then we have departments. Our departments here is the informational system. There should be some form of traceability or transparency between the departments, and there is a flow cycle. So in Tier 1, we have the overall engagement and development of our ICT strategy. In Tier 2, we have the prioritization of organizational missions and business functions for conducting business level or mission level risk assessments, implementing Tier 1 strategies and guidance to establish the overarching organizational capabilities of ICT in regards to our supply chain risk and guidance. Tier 3 would involve the specific ICT activities applied to individual informational systems and IT acquisitions, including the integration of ICT into the system's processes. Again, Tier 3 doesn't necessarily have to only be IT. It could be other departments, but Tier 3 basically involves the department or business function activities that would then be reviewed for protection. So let's look at the supply chain risk areas. So again, we have our risk, we have our supplies, our environmental, our demand, our processes, our contingencies, our controls. So these are all related back to risk. Now we need to look at which ones are internal, which ones are external. A huge part here is understanding that not all threats are going to be internal. So when we are looking at our threats, controls, contingency, process, those are all internal. Demand is external, environment is external. The supply could be external. It really just depends. Here the supply is the upstream equivalent of demand. It relates to the potential or actual disturbances of the flow of product or data within the supply chain. Our environment is going to be regulations, customs, tariffs, taxes, quotas, ethics possibly. Demand is just that, the uncertainty within a specific demand structure. It will also refer to the disturbances to the flow of the product information or cash from within the supply chain. So there are some different external factors that go in here. Also, we have to look at intellectual property rights, and we need to look at what are our metrics. Oftentimes, we need to have a proper way of measuring this content to ensure that we are using the correct measurements or metrics. So what are intellectual property rights, or IPRs? These are rights to the body of knowledge, concepts, ideas that were produced by either an entity or individual that are claimed by that entirety of the organization and of the copyright type. Basically, it's the rights to the knowledge, it's the rights to a patent, it's the right to a concept. KPI, or Key Performance Indicator, it's a quantifiable metric agreed upon beforehand that will reflect the critical success factors of an organization. Basically, if we say these are our key areas that we are looking for success, if those numbers are high, then we know we are successful. These are the key areas that are reviewed for performance indication. So what are threats to the organization or to performance? Threats come in multiple tiers. We do have a SDLC. We do have a life cycle that we can review it. Normally tier 1 are related to the organization, the mission, the suppliers. Tier 2 is going to be more mission, function, geographical areas, types of suppliers, and technology. Tier 3 again is at SDLC. So there's always different ways to categorize the information. One of the big ones, especially dealing with intellectual property, is data exfiltration. Exfiltration is normally a process that automates the sending of data, whether it's credentials, whether it's credit card data, back to someone. It is taking data from one network and sending it outside that network. It is closely related to malware or to viruses, and it's typically where we are seeing data breaches. They take protected information and then it leaves the network. The data is exfiltrated from the source network back to an attacker. That is one way of a data breach occurring. What is interesting is there is actually a structure as it relates to the exfiltration of data. So it's typically called a chain threat event, but basically they will perform reconnaissance, they'll gather information, they will use a attack tool, whether it is crafting or creating some type of an attack. They will deliver, install, and insert their malicious capability into target. They will wait. They will exploit and compromise when appropriate. And within that structure, they might also conduct additional indirect or coordinated attacks. They may also build in the ability to maintain persistence if someone finds the original source of an attack. And again, these aren't hard, fast. These aren't always 100% accurate, but these are the general areas where the hacking phases typically deliver. So again, reconnaissance, the attack, the creation of the attack, the actual delivery of the attack, exploit, compromise, typically either conduct another attack or do some type of maintenance to maintain your persistence if you are found. Other vulnerabilities to consider are again the different tiers. Again, looking at the mission, the relationship, the geographics. If we're looking at tier 2, again, geographics, the type, the technology, and then tier 3 are the individual technology solutions that might be there. Again, vulnerability considerations are all really relative to the organization. So we normally budget for tier 1, tier 2. Tier 1 is a type of vulnerability that is a weakness, might be a compliance, could be a lack of planning. Tier 2 is going to be normally no budget associated with it, so it could be bad parts or things like that. And tier 3 are a little bit worse than that. Again, typically little to no funding for protection. Tier 1 is where they spend the majority of their funding. Alright, so what are some of the controls? Controls could be your traditional access control, or training, or auditing, or configuration management. Again, if we are looking at any of the controls we've been discussing in the previous chapters, that's the areas that we're going to be applying them. Incident response, maintenance, planning, protection, program management, personnel, risk, risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, vulnerability review, and then patching. What's really interesting is this provenance section. So provenance is basically a new family of control outlined by the 800-163, and that does not appear in the 853, and it's known as the provenance control. Basically, for ICT systems, records for describing the possession of and changes to components, component processes, information systems, organizations, or processes. Provenance enables the change to be a baseline of components, processes, information, systems, organizational processes to be reported to the appropriate actor, functions, locals, or activity. So this is just a better reporting feature. The concept of provenance relates to the fact that all systems and components originate at some point in the supply chain and can be changed throughout their existence before retirement. The record of a system and its components originally, along with the history, all the changes, are called provenance. So what are some of the provenance controls? So there are 3 security controls outlined by the 800-163 provenance family DILs, and they are policies and procedures for dealing with provenance, tracking the development of a baseline of provenance, and auditing the roles and responsibilities of provenance. Those are the 3 key areas for provenance controls. So what are some of the best practices? So there's a number of resources out there for information security forums, as well as standards for good practices. Whether we're talking the NIST 7622 or the ISO 2800 series, there's tons out there. Part of the ISO 28000 or 28000 series, we have specifications for management for supply chain, best practices for implementing supply chain security, requirements for bodies providing auditing for supply chain security, and guidelines for implementation of ISO 28000. So there are tons out there. There's also resources for common CISOs for those responsible for supply chain management or overseeing supply chain. Oftentimes, the resources are there, they just actually have to be reviewed. So one of the big areas of supply chain is actually cloud computing, the ability to use resources that aren't physically located within your sphere of control. So for the enterprise cloud computing, this would involve moving substantial portions or all of their infrastructure to an internet-based infrastructure or a cloud-based infrastructure. While other groups like NIST will define cloud computing as a model for enabling unique, convenient, or on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources that can rapidly provision and release with minimal management of effort by the service provider interaction. This cloud model promotes availability and is comprised of several essentials and several service models and deployment models. It says 5 essential characteristics, 3 service models, and 4 deployment models. But with that, you got to be very careful because those standards definitely do keep changing. Here are the main areas for the essential characteristics. That's high-speed internet, rapid elasticity, measured services, on-demand services, and a resource pool. The service model is software, platform, and infrastructure as a service. And then the deployment models are public, private, hybrid, or some form of community-based cloud computing. So we're going to explore these areas. So for the essentials, we need to have high-speed internet. The ability to grow or shrink as necessary is the elasticity. The measured services is basically optimizing and automatically controlling resources so we can meter them so we can actually bill accordingly. On-demand services, basically the consumer can provision the resources as necessary without having to interface with the service provider. And again, resources should be pooled so that they can grow or shrink as necessary and grow in accordance. For cloud computing, again, we have our NIST define the service models. Software as a service, that is the software component of the software. So let's say email as a service. Instead of you hosting your own exchange, you could host, Microsoft could host your email. That would be software as a service. Platform as a service would be the actual platforms, your operating systems and things like that. Maybe your switching environment. So the consumers could provision fundamentals of the infrastructure, the network, the storage, the processing. That'd be the infrastructure as a service. Let's say you need a Windows 10 machine. That'd be platform. If you need a specific amount of storage on the network, that could be infrastructure. If you need a server with X amount of hardware, that could be infrastructure as a service. So these models actually help define how we organize the different management. There are 4 deployment models: public, private, community, hybrid. Hybrid is any 2 or combination of the other types. A public cloud is basically infrastructure made available to the general public or the large industry and is owned by an organization selling cloud services. Amazon AWS is a public cloud. Microsoft Azure is a public cloud. You could also have organizations that have their own cloud infrastructure and it is operated solely for a single organization. That's a private cloud. A community cloud is infrastructure that is shared between multiple organizations or a specific community. And again, a hybrid is any combination thereof. There are references that you can use. There are reference architectures that depict a higher level of structure. So the NIST 500-292, which focusing on the cloud compute reference architecture, they basically show you the high level, how to design it, and with the appropriate controls and how to facilitate all of the components. So here we have our architect again, reference model. It's used for high-level overview to illustrate very specific materials. It provides the technical references for consumers to understand, and it facilitates the analysis of candidate standards for security, interoperability, portability, and reference and implementation possibilities. Here we have our cloud architecture just kind of designed into one. We have our consumed resources, our auditors, our providers, our privacy and security requirements, our brokers, and kind of all key areas in between. Under our cloud provider, we have our management and our service and resource areas. For other security considerations for cloud computing, it's confidentiality, the protection of data, and the privacy of data. Also, understanding where the responsibilities are. Who's responsible for a data breach? Responsibility of notifying. Risk of exposure of IP. What are the controls? What are the export controls? What are the possible bleed over controls? Are there e-discovery requirements that might be there? If the FBI needs to view all storage of your data and it's stored on an AWS cloud, if the FBI sees those disks, it may be more than just your data on that storage device. So there are a number of considerations that have to be there covering all legal concerns. The common threats for cloud user: trust, that's always a big one. Governance, responsibility concerns, misconfigured or non-secure cloud services, data loss and data leakage, lack of the ability to manage your physical assets, and sometimes really hard to conduct certain risk assessments or vulnerability assessments when you don't control the underlying hardware of some of your key services. Risk evaluation, again, it's useful to have a detailed questionnaire for identifying your risk and to evaluating your cloud services. The template that you should be working with should have high-level descriptions, your AAA authentication, authorization, and availability requirements, your security requirements for data and user access, recoverability time organization, some form of separation but clear outlining of responsibilities and responses, as well as testing, validation, and verification of security controls. Best practices normally fall into your preliminary, your initial, and your concluding activities. The 800-144 guidelines on security of privacy and cloud computing have to be there. There are structures here to identify what activities should go where and what those activities really are. For the preliminary activities, it's identifying security and privacy for requirements. The initiating and coincident activities will ensure all contractual requirements are explicit. The concluding activities basically alert the provider about any contractual requirements that must be observed upon termination, or again, anything that is happening at the end of contract. The cloud service agreements could be an acceptable use, could be policies governing privacy and customer agreements, and lastly, we will have some form of cloud level agreement focusing on what services are provided, including the appropriate uptimes. Lastly, we have the best practices for our breakdown, whether they're internal or external suppliers, whether they are computing resources, whether they are supplier management, whether we are talking about the objectives on enforcing contract agreements. All right, and that is it for this chapter. We've covered a ton of material focusing on supply chain and relating the basics of cloud computing back to supply chain. So that is all for this chapter. If you have questions or concerns, please reach out. Thank you. So this concludes our lecture review on this book. Questions, concerns, or thoughts, leave a comment, make a statement, get a hold of me. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Remember that when we do some of this, it is critical that we ensure that we're answering your questions. Don't just listen and don't try to apply. Listen, try to apply what we've been discussing, and when possible, if you're not understanding something, say something.